Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really thought-provoking piece, historically significant too. Manning Johnson's 1958 pamphlet, Color, Communism, and Common Sense.
Right. We're going to explore Johnson's own account, his firsthand view of the Communist Party's activities within the African American community
Hmm.
back in the mid-20th century.
And it's quite a unique lens, isn't it? Because this comes from someone who was, well, deeply involved before he turned against it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The pamphlet itself, it has a foreword by Archibald B. Roosevelt, which frames Johnson as, an insider who saw the light, so to speak, and then faced a lot of criticism for speaking out.
So, for you, the learner, our mission here is to really unpack the arguments Johnson is making. What strategies did he see the communists using? How did he think they impacted race relations?
And importantly, what led to his own disillusionment.
Mm,
We need to stress, though, we're examining his viewpoint from that time, a specific historical document. We're not endorsing it, just exploring the ideas presented.
absolutely. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. What actually drew Johnson towards communism in the first place?
Well, from his own account, Johnson was a black man, grew up religious, but he was deeply frustrated by the racial injustice he saw everywhere. That feeling, that, deep dissatisfaction.
Made him look for alternatives.
Yes, exactly. And communism, or at least the promise of it, seemed to offer this vision of a world without those racial and class divides. It was appealing.
Did he mention specific people or ideas that influenced him?
He did. He mentions a black graduate from the Lenin Institute in Moscow, a key training ground for communists, who sort of presented this vision to him.
Okay,
And also the teachings of William Montgomery Brown, who was actually a retired Episcopal bishop who'd also embraced communism.
interesting mix.
Yeah. Johnson essentially came to believe that capitalism was the root cause of racial inequality. So joining forces with those opposing capitalism felt like the logical step.
But that initial hope, that idealism, it didn't last, did it? He suggests it soured pretty quickly.
That's really central to his argument. He says he realized that the very real, legitimate grievances that he and other black people felt were being, well, used, exploited for a bigger political game.
So their own desire for justice was turned into a weapon.
That's how he puts it, weaponized against capitalism. And he saw specific tactics like these front organizations as key to this.
Right. He mentions joining through the American Negro Labor Congress. What exactly was the purpose of these fronts, according to him?
They were designed to be sort of entry points. They'd attract people, especially black individuals, who were passionate about justice, but maybe hesitant about joining the Communist Party outright.
So a softer approach to recruitment.
Kind of. The American Negro Labor Congress, for instance, could mask the party's deeper aims and draw people in who might otherwise have stayed away. It was strategic.
So you join thinking it's one thing, but then.
Then, according to Johnson, you get brought deeper in. He talks about receiving training, practical training, in things like street demonstrations, how to incite mob violence, confronting police, political tactics, stuff like throwing a brick and hiding, as he puts it.
Wow, that sounds like a very rapid shift from fighting injustice to something else.
It does. And he suggests this commitment, this training, and, his loyalty helped him rise really quickly in the party.
How high did he get?
Pretty high. He became a district organizer, then got onto the national committee that was the top decision-making body in the U.S. party. He was even apparently considered for the Politburo, the real inner circle.
And it's from that vantage point that he describes the inner workings, especially the control from Moscow.
Yes, and this is where it gets really interesting. He talks about the National Negro Commission. Now, on paper, it was focused on black issues, but Johnson claims it was actually tightly controlled by Moscow through white American communists.
He uses that term overseers, right?
He does. He says these white members were like overseers, holding the real power, making the key decisions, even over the black members who might have had the titles.
So a clear hierarchy, with Moscow at the top, then these white American communists, then the black members sort of carrying out orders.
That's the picture he paints. He says they'd use flattery on certain black members, make them feel important, but their main job was just enforcing the party line with other black members.
And deviation wasn't tolerated?
Not at all. Any sign of what they called petty bourgeois nationalism, basically putting black interests ahead of the party's, was stamped out hard.
He also makes some pretty disturbing claims about the role of white women in the party.
Yeah, that's a really unsettling part of his account. He alleges that white communist women were used strategically for espionage. Bedroom politics, he calls it.
Meaning,
Forming relationships with high-level black communists to gather intelligence, personal details, finances, political leanings. He even claims these relationships were sometimes used for blackmail to ensure loyalty.
That's incredibly cynical, if true. A ruthless way to maintain control.
It suggests a very calculated approach.
Yeah.
And all these experiences about the perceived cruelty, the ruthlessness, the contempt for Christian values he saw, the low value placed on human life, the betrayals, that's what ultimately drove his disillusionment, according to his pamphlet.
It's a powerful rejection. Okay, let's shift to another major theme in his writing. The strategy towards black churches. This seems crucial to his analysis.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is how he describes a change in strategy. Initially, say before the mid-1930s, the party saw black churches as, well, an enemy.
An obstacle.
Right. They actively attacked them. They felt the focus on heaven and the afterlife held people back from the revolution they wanted now on earth. So the instruction was, fight the church's influence.
But that changed dramatically.
Completely. According to Johnson, he says Moscow ordered a U-turn. Stop attacking. Start infiltrating. Subvert them from the inside.
Why the change?
Because they realized the churches held immense power and influence in the black community. Millions of potential followers, a built-in network. Why fight it when you could try to, well, co-opt it?
So a strategic pivot from opposition to infiltration. How did they actually try to do that? It seems like a difficult shift to manage.
Well, the new line, as Johnson describes it, was to reframe religion. Present Jesus as like a proto-communist, a worker, a fighter against the capitalists of his day.
Trying to align Jesus with their ideology.
Exactly. And top leaders like Earl Browder and Gerhard Eisler apparently stress how important it was politically to get inside these church organizations. They saw churches as, and this is a quote he attributes, the best cover for illegal work, especially down south.
And he gives examples of the infiltration methods.
He does. He talks about white ministers acting like missionaries, using race issues as bait to connect with black ministers. Also, things like bribery gifts, paying for lectures flattery, getting favorable press in communist papers.
And darker methods, too.
Yes, he alleges the use of sex and perversion for blackmail against church leaders and setting up secret communist cells within congregations to control things from the top down.
It paints a really disturbing picture of a deliberate campaign to manipulate a core community institution, which leads us to what he calls the red plot to use Negroes. This sounds like a central accusation.
It is. Connecting it to the wider Cold War context, Johnson claims Stalin himself, way back in 1928, ordered the party to exploit all the existing divisions, racial, economic, social conflict, particularly in the American South.
To what end?
The goal, Johnson argues, was to stir up discontent, maybe even incite a black rebellion, ultimately aiming to destabilize America, maybe even split the country through racial conflict. That's his interpretation of the Red Plot.
A huge claim. And what about the human cost? How did the communists view the potential danger to black people in such a scenario?
Johnson quotes a communist source saying, chillingly, "A communist is not a sentimentalist. The cause came first." Even if it meant potentially millions of black lives lost in what they apparently feared might be an abortive attempt at rebellion in the South.
So the lives were secondary to the political goal.
That's his assertion. Interestingly, he adds that the white communist leaders in the U.S. were reportedly worried about a rebellion happening too soon, before they were ready up north in the industrial centers.
But Johnson also assigned some responsibility, maybe controversially, to certain black communists in pushing this.
Yes, that's a really provocative part. He argues that a specific group of black communists kept pushing Moscow to pressure the American Party leadership to actually do more organizing among black people.
He labels them.
He controversially calls them potential political Uncle Toms. His argument is that in their dedication to communism, they ended up collaborating with a foreign power in a way he believed harmed their own people.
That's a very loaded term to use there. He also mentions the internal party dynamics before this Moscow intervention.
Right. He quotes another black communist writer who admitted there was white chauvinism, white supremacist attitudes within the party itself, which had actually hindered their work among black people earlier on.
So Moscow's push changed that.
According to this view, yes. It led to black communists getting more prominent roles, better training, but also shifted their primary loyalty, Johnson argues, towards Stalin and the international movement.
And this intensified effort led to more front organizations.
Exactly. He lists groups like the American Negro Labor Congress again, the League of Struggle for Negro Rights, and others. He claims major institutions like Howard University were targeted for subversion too. and that white leftists worked with black individuals, the ones he calls Uncle Toms, to create this appearance of interracialism that was really just a cover.
Okay, let's move to his concept of the bane of red integration. This is where he argues that the communist push for integration actually hurt black progress in some ways. How does he make that case?
It's a complex argument. His core idea is that this specific communist-driven focus on integration actively opposed and undermined projects that were aimed squarely at black self-help and community building.
Can you give an example he uses?
A key one is about a proposed black-founded and run hospital in Harlem back in the 30s. Johnson claims that certain black intellectuals, influenced by communist anti-segregationist ideas, actually opposed it.
Why would they oppose a black hospital?
Their argument, according to Johnson, was that it would encourage segregation. But he contrasts this with someone like Claude McKay, who apparently argued the hospital would actually help break down segregation by showcasing black talent and serving the community.
So conflicting views on the best path forward. Any other examples?
Yeah, he mentions similar opposition to a black community development project, again, dismissed as segregation, even though other ethnic groups had similar initiatives.
Mhm.
And he tells this story about a black dentist who moved to a white area, but then worried about other black families moving in. For Johnson, this showed a focus on individual acceptance over collective black advancement.
And Johnson breaks down these integration advocates into types.
Sort of. He sees some as genuinely seeking personal acceptance, maybe assimilation. Others, he claims, were basically paid agents for white real estate interests, manipulating things for profit. And then Blockbuster's families used intentionally to stir up resentment in white neighborhoods.
A very cynical view of the motives.
He argues that the Reds and their allies, the progressives, would only fund projects likely to cause racial conflict, not ones aimed at building solid black communities.
And he pushes back against calling black neighborhoods ghettos.
Strongly. He points out that lots of ethnic groups live together doesn't automatically make it a ghetto in the historical forced sense. He felt calling black neighborhoods ghettos was a communist tactic to undermine pride and initiative.
So his overall point is that this specific push for integration paralyzed needed black-led projects.
Yes, that opposing race-specific initiatives in the name of immediate total integration actually held black people back and fostered a negative self-image. It's a controversial take, for sure.
Definitely. Now, his chapter Destroying the Opposition, this sounds like it details the darker side of party discipline.
It does. And interestingly, he starts by acknowledging that some black newspapers initially supported the Communist Party back when they were loudly advocating for equal rights. He even quotes the Afro-American praising the Reds.
But that support didn't last for those who questioned the party.
Not according to Johnson. He claims that support turned to hostility if you stepped out of line, and the party actively worked to elevate those who did toe the line.
How so?
He alleges that black intellectuals and professionals who aligned with the party were strategically promoted, given platforms, made into race leaders through party influence. He gives examples, like mentioning someone allegedly helped by Alger Hiss.
A very charged name in the Cold War context.
Exactly. And he mentions a black federal judge who he claims ruled in favor of the communist conspiracy. He presents these as examples of how aligning with the party could bring rewards and influence.
But for those who didn't align, or who left,
The consequences were harsh, he claims. He talks about successful jobs campaigns to discredit anti-communists serving as warnings. He even hints darkly at the hand of the assassin, linking the deaths of some black ex-communists like George Hewitt and William Knoll to their opposition to the party.
that's extremely serious.
Very. He also describes the party's disciplinary machinery labeling defectors as informers, leading to slander, threats, isolation. Loyalty to the party, he stresses, was demanded above race, family, everything. He names figures like James Jackson and Harry Haywood as key leaders in this cadre.
And he brings up the term Uncle Tom again here in terms of how it was used.
Yes, he argues the communists deliberately twisted the term, took it from its complex literary origins, and weaponized it as the ultimate insult trader to silence any black person, advocating for more gradual or peaceful approaches to racial progress. Anyone not following the militant line could be branded an Uncle Tom.
Which sets up his next chapter, The Real Uncle Toms, where he completely flips that accusation.
Right. This is where he argues, quite provocatively, that the real Uncle Toms, in his view, were the black communists themselves.
Why?
because he saw them as serving white masters within the Communist Party hierarchy, blindly following orders from Moscow and white American leaders. He uses the party's own internal critiques to back this up.
Internal critiques?
Yeah, he cites writings by Pettis Perry, who was a black communist leader. Johnson says Perry himself wrote about the ongoing racial prejudice within the party. Things like white communists signing restrictive housing covenants to keep black people out of their neighborhoods, or white members avoiding living in black areas, or just basic social segregation between white and black comrades. Johnson quotes Perry directly from the communist journal Political Affairs on this.
So using a communist source to highlight hypocrisy within the movement.
Exactly. Johnson's point is that these black communists were being misled by a party that didn't even practice the equality it preached, while attacking other black leaders as Uncle Toms. He also argues prejudice isn't unique to any one race.
Okay, moving into his chapter, Creating Hate. How does he argue the communists fostered racial hatred?
He claims the party's propagandists systematically distorted facts about race to fuel their agenda. They rejected any idea of inherent racial superiority, but, he says, they blamed all problems faced by black Americans solely on white leaders.
Removing black agency entirely.
That's his argument. He says this fosters self-pity, blame, jealousy, dependency, a whole cocktail of negative emotions. And this climate of blame and resentment creates the hate that the communists could then exploit politically.
And he connects this directly to organizations like the NAACP.
Very directly and very critically, he calls the NAACP the National Association for the Agitation of Colored People. He implies their main focus became agitation, stirring conflict, rather than constructive community building.
He mentions their finances.
Yeah, he notes a report by Roy Wilkins about the NAACP having a great financial year, but Johnson questions if that money was actually going towards tangible improvements in black communities or just more agitation.
In Little Rock.
He presents the Little Rock school integration crisis as a prime example of, in his view, the NAACP and the communists deliberately creating or escalating an incident purely for its propaganda value, both in the U.S. and abroad.
He also challenges the narrative about education access, doesn't he?
He does, quite forcefully. He argues it's wrong to say black people were simply denied education. He points to free schools, black colleges, scholarships, arguing opportunities existed, even if unequal. He finds it ironic that some leaders inciting conflict had themselves benefited from these systems.
So what was the integration fight really about, in his view?
He suggests it wasn't always about better education, but sometimes about dismantling black schools and displacing black teachers. He cites examples of black educators losing jobs in border states after integration.
And he disagrees with the premise that integrated classrooms were inherently better.
Yeah, he dismisses the idea that black children needed to sit next to white children to learn effectively. He points to academic struggles in some integrated northern schools and contrasts it with achievers like George Washington Carver, who excelled despite huge limitations. The real danger for Johnson was this persecution and hate complex being drummed up.
Okay, let's look at his chapter, Modern-Day Carpetbaggers. He's using a very loaded historical term there. Who is he applying it to?
He's applying it to Northerners, communists, liberals, politicians, other activists who he accuses of meddling in the South's racial situation for their own gain or ideological reasons.
Interfering how?
He says they bypass local black leaders, deliberately set up provocative situations, and then exploit the resulting chaos and tension for propaganda. And anyone who resists gets smeared as a race baiter, or, again, an Uncle Tom.
He sees this as intentionally stirring up old wounds.
Yes, old sectional bitterness between North and South, old racial hatreds. He believes it actually hinders real progress. He also blames the media, suggesting it's influenced by communists who eagerly amplify any racial incident to make America look bad internationally.
And northern politicians.
He accuses them of using leftist racial propaganda just to get black votes, with no real concern for black people in the South. But he sees the Communist Party as the truly organized force behind it all, manipulating these various groups to cause maximum disruption.
So the carpetbagger analogy is about outsiders causing trouble for selfish reasons.
Precisely. Like the post-Civil War figures, he sees them as motivated by self-interest and causing mischief. He even demands government agencies expose the backgrounds of these individuals inciting division.
He anticipates the pushback to that, really.
Oh, yeah. He predicts cries of anti-Negro bias would be used to shut down any investigation into communist links. He laments what he sees as a lack of courage to stand up to these leftist agendas.
And he offers alternative role models.
Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. He holds them up as examples of achieving progress through self-reliance, hard work, community focus, contrasting their philosophies sharply with the approaches he's criticizing.
Interesting. Next, race pride is passé. What's his argument here about black businesses and identity?
He argues that black entrepreneurs are a specific target for communists. Why? Because their success within the free enterprise system directly contradicts communist ideology. They're living proof capitalism can work for black people.
So the policy is anti-black business.
Fundamentally, yes. He claims communists label successful black businesses as just a product of segregation, while also subtly discouraging black entrepreneurship by playing up business competition.
And he criticizes black consumers, too.
He points out what he sees as hypocrisy. Black individuals embracing patronage of white businesses as integration, while simultaneously neglecting or even looking down upon black-owned businesses, sometimes to their own community's detriment.
It gives examples.
Yeah, he mentions conventions in cities like Detroit and Miami where black delegates might avoid black establishments. He contrasts this with a Church of God in Christ convention in Miami that he says made a conscious effort to support black businesses.
And he links this back to intellectuals.
He warns that black intellectuals are susceptible to communist influence, partly due to, in his view, a weakening of independent thought and racial pride, making them reliant on guidance from phony white liberals.
Okay, in his final main chapter, Wisdom Needed, what's the path forward he suggests?
He starts by pointing out that many ethnic or national groups have their own organizations, without anyone calling it segregation, just because black people aren't the focus. He finds it absurd that black intellectuals often view black-only organizing as segregation.
He calls this a slave psychology.
Yes, a kind of continued need for white validation or approval. But he believes that beneath that intellectual layer, ordinary black Americans do have a strong racial consciousness.
And what do they desire, according to him?
Simple, practical progress through education, being reliable workers, being productive members of society. He circles back to criticize the rejection of Booker T. Washington's focus on industrial training, blaming leftists like Du Bois for hindering black economic power.
So he's advocating for practicality over confrontation.
Pretty much. Practical solutions, peaceful coexistence where possible, not constant hostility. He slams the unrealistic alien behavior of extreme integrationists and their name-calling.
And he sees danger in their approach.
He argues they've actually created the conditions for potential violence through extreme demands and rejecting any compromise. His final harsh assessment is that they lack love for their own people or America, and their real loyalty lies with the Kremlin.
A very strong conclusion, and the pamphlet includes appendices.
Yes, just briefly, he includes testimony from James A. Cobb, a black professor at Howard, who was warning about communist sympathies he saw in Howard's president at the time, Mordecai Johnson.
Adding weight to his claims about infiltration.
And he also mentions Professor Kelly Miller as another example of a patriotic black intellectual he admired.
Okay, so wrapping this up, Manning Johnson's Color, Communism, and Common Sense is clearly this intense, personal, and, highly controversial account.
Absolutely. It stems from his journey out of the Communist Party. His core arguments focus on how communists, as he saw it, exploited black grievances, used front groups, subverted institutions like churches.
And he argued their push for integration could be counterproductive while they ruthlessly silenced opposition. He ends up critiquing black leaders he felt were helping the communists, advocating instead for self-reliance.
And it's so important for you, the learner, to remember the context. This is 1958. Johnson had dramatically broken with communism. The Cold War anti-communist feeling was intense. You have to consider his motivations, his potential biases when reading this.
Definitely. So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Thinking about Johnson's claims, how do big external ideologies, communist or otherwise, how do they intersect with and maybe manipulate complex things like race relations within a community?
Yeah, what are the potential long-term effects when outside political movements get deeply involved in local social dynamics, regardless of the specific ideology?
It certainly makes you think about the complex history of the civil rights movement and all the different forces at play. Something worth exploring further. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.